Good morning, grade 11. Today we're starting a new chapter, chapter 8, section 1. Uh, the last 2 weeks we talked about the history of Greece, we talked about the geography of Greece, we talked about the Greek city-states and the Greek wars. Now this chapter talks mainly about the culture, the religion, the philosophers, the gods, the myths. How did the Greek people live? So it's more of cultural wise more than it's historical and geographical wise. Now, the ancient Greeks, even though they were independent politically and they were divided into many city-states, but they were united by a common culture. They all spoke the Greek language. They all shared the same beliefs and customs. Now, the Greek people also believed that many of these customs were oral traditions. Oral traditions are stories or passed out talk from one generation to the other. These oral traditions can be true or they can be wrong. But the point is that they are transmitted or moved on from one generation to the other, from the ancestors to the children. Now, the Greek people also believed in a lot of myths. A myth is a traditional story about a god or a hero. There were a lot of Greek myths, and Greek myths expressed the religious beliefs of the ancient Greeks. Now, one of the myths that the Greeks believed in was that they believed in gods and goddesses. Uh, the Greek gods and goddesses were different than the other empires because the Greeks did not think that their gods were powerful beings, but instead they look like humans, they act like humans, but they have great powers. Now, in Greek mythology, the gods married and had children, and each god was responsible for a certain task or a certain sign. The Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus, which is Greece's highest mountain. They had 12 most important gods, and the others were either siblings or children. Now, the main chief god was Zeus. He was king of the gods, and his sign was the thunder. He was responsible, or he was the god of the sky, rain, and lightning. Now, Zeus had brothers and sisters. Zeus's sister was Hera. She was the goddess of marriage. Zeus's brother was Hades. He was the god of the underworld or the dead. Another brother was Poseidon. He was the god of the sea. And finally, the goddess of the home is known as Hestia. Now, Zeus got married and had children. The famous children was, first of all, Athena. She was the goddess of wisdom and she was the protector of the deities or the women. Ares, the god of war. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Hermes, the messenger of the gods and the god of the market. Apollo, the god of light. And Artemis, the goddess of the wild animals. And she is the twin sister of Apollo. Now, these were the chief or the main important gods. As we said, the chief god was Zeus. He was the king of the Olympian gods. Athena was the second chief goddess for the Greeks. Now, all Greeks worshipped Zeus, and each city-state chose one god or one goddess apart from Zeus as its protector. There was a certain ritual or an action that is part of a religious ceremony that people worshipped the god not only in temples but also at homes. They prayed and they offered their gifts to the gods. Through these rituals, the Greeks hoped that the gods would reward them. Now, The Greeks also carried out festivals to honor the gods and goddesses. Each city-state scheduled a public feast and made sacrifices. Also, each 4 years, the Greek athletes took part in athletic competitions. These games were always done for the glory of Zeus. They were held at the city of Olympia and they were called the Olympic Games. At the beginning of 1776, the ancient Olympic Games started. This was the first ancient Olympic Games to happen at all. Now, the first modern Olympics were held in 1896 in Athens. So the first Olympic Games to happen at all was in 776 BC. And then after the Greek, Roman, and all of the ancient empires, the Greeks started the Olympic Games again, and the first modern Olympic Games were held in 1896, also in Athens. Now, the Greeks believed that their gods would be happy or pleased if the people showed skills in arts, learning, athletic games, and in thinking. Now, apart from the gods, the Greeks also believed that each person had a fate or a destiny, and that certain events were going to happen no matter what they did. They also believed in prophecy or prediction of the future. To find out about the future, the Greeks visited an oracle. An oracle was a sacred shrine where a priest or a priestess sat and spoke on behalf of God. The most famous was the oracle at the temple of Apollo at Delphi or Delphi. The oracle chamber was so deep inside the temple, and the room had an opening in the floor where the volcanic smoke cracked into the earth. The priestess, just like the picture at the top here, sat on the stool or the high chair and listened to the questions. And then she would, as if, listen to what the gods say and translate back the answers to the people. A lot of people traveled from very far city-states to the oracle at Delphi to ask for advice from the oracle of Apollo. Now, as we said, Greeks had many myths and passed down stories. Now, Greeks believed in epics and fables, or they had many epics and fables. So, what's an epic and what's a fable? Before we start, Shakespeare borrowed a lot of Greek plots and settings for his dramas. And the Greek drama was the first type of stories that were invented. Now, the first Greek stories were epics. Going back to the new word epic. An epic is a story that talks about events that happened and usually ends in a sad way. In an epic, the stories are usually about war and the actions are very tense. Now, the first Greek epic, or the two most famous Greek epics, were the Iliad and the Odyssey, that were written by Homer. Now, Homer based these two epics on the stories about the war between Greece and Troy, which you all know as the Trojan War. In the Iliad, a prince of Troy falls in love with Helen, who is the wife of a Greek king, and kidnaps her. The kidnapping angers the king, and the Greeks decide to attack Troy in revenge. The Greeks, however, cannot break through the thick walls of the city. So, in order to get inside the city, the Greeks trick the Trojans and they construct a huge wooden horse. They sat inside it and they stopped the horse at the gates of the Trojan city. Trojans thought that they won the war and that the horse is a gift from the Greeks as a sign of their loss. So the Trojans pulled the horse inside the city And at night, while the Trojans were asleep, the Greeks crept out of the horse, opened the city gates, allowed the rest of the Greek army to get into the city. They rescued Helen and they burned Troy. This was the Iliad, the first epic. The second epic, the Odyssey, talks about the story of Odysseus, who is a Greek hero from the Trojan War, and he finished and he won in the Trojan War and he was going back home. It describes his long trip home after the fall of Troy. He faces storms, monsters, witches, and all kinds of wicked creatures along the way. Odysseus finally returns to his home and wife. According to the poem, it takes Odysseus 10 years to go back to Greece. Today, people use the word Odyssey as a word to describe a very long, exciting, and exhausting journey. Greeks believed that the Iliad and the Odyssey were more than stories. They looked at these epics as real stories, not only told stories. These poems gave the Greeks positivity and they gave them honor about their ancestors. It taught them courage and it taught them loyalty to their country and friends. Homer was always trying to pass down the good values of courage, honor, loyalty uh, through his epics so that they can be passed on from one generation to the other.